Good morning. Today is December 5th, 2006. We're at the home of Mr. Wayne Tennant at his home in Loveland, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans Oral History Project. Good morning, Mr. Tennant.
Good morning, Brad.
Thank you for participating in this project.
Well, my daughter has been after me, as well as other relatives, for me to tell my story and put it on tape so they'd have something after I'm gone. So they brought the newspaper over and left it here and said for me to get with it. And
Very good.
So I made the call.
Well, we'll get her down on tape then. Why don't we start out, if we could, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you were born, your date of birth, and a little bit about what you were doing before joining the service.
Sure. Okay. I was born June 16, 1918, and that was in the country in Nebraska. Probably the nearest town doesn't exist anymore, but it was near Ansley, Nebraska, which is still there. And I grew up in tough times. The jobs were non-existent, and if you could find a job, the employer sometimes couldn't pay, so you had to work until he got some money, and then he'd pay you a little bit. And so I didn't plan on ever going to college, so I went for a general education in school, and I went to started with a country one-room schoolhouse where all the grades sit in one room and the teacher talks to the whole room. You couldn't help but listen to what everybody was being told. So a few years in that one-room schoolhouse, which I started when I was 4 years old, I got sort of a general education. And when I then, due to my folks moving to town, I started in a city school in Ansley, Nebraska, and they tried me in one grade and then another, and they kept moving me up. So, time I got through, I guess we moved to Broken Bow then from Ansley when I finished grade school, and I started high school in Broken Bow and graduated when I was 16 years old. And that was in 1935, and the Depression was in full swing. So tried my best to find some kind of work. While I was in high school, I had sort of a full-time job on Saturdays, and I got $1 for that because I had a license to test cream. And so I tested cream on Saturdays, and through the week I cleaned out the chicken cages and built egg cases, and I think I got about 10-15 cents for cleaning out the cages and a penny a case for building the 30 dozen egg cases. So anyway, times were tough, and didn't know what I was going to end up doing in life, but I ended up having an uncle of mine get a job for me in Grand Island, Nebraska, and I ended up driving a truck and going out and delivering ice cream and frozen vegetables, and then on the way back into town I would buy cream and eggs. I would test the cream and write a check, or I would buy the eggs from the merchants and write them a check for the eggs. And that's what I was doing when it came time for me to get a notice in the mail. In 1941 I got my draft notice and was drafted on the 19th of February 1941, before the war.
Now, was that a welcome relief as far as as far as a career, or just having a job, or what were your feelings when you got that notice?
I had mixed feelings. At that time, they had guaranteed everybody that if they had a job when they got drafted, the employer guaranteed you your job back when your year was up. So I felt good about that, and but I saw that this was a chance to get out of Nebraska and see what the rest of the United States looked like. So I had never seen anybody in uniform except on Armistice Day, the veterans from World War I would have sort of a ceremony, and they'd put on their caps and fire their rifles. And that's the closest thing I ever saw in the way of a uniform. So getting drafted in the Army, I didn't know what was ahead of me. It was all a new experience.
Was there any worries? You said this was prior to us entering the war. Was there any thought or concern about the war raging in Europe, that we would be drawn into that?
No, apparently Roosevelt, who was president, in all that you heard on the radio and read in the newspaper, he did not want to see the United States back into any sort of a conflict. World War I was supposed to be the end of world wars. So didn't really have any concern about being in combat, but of course I found out that you were to get ready for combat when I got into the first unit in the Army.
So how much longer after you got your notice did you ship off to boot camp then?
I think it was about maybe a month ahead, and you got your number, and then you got a draft number, and then the numbers were drawn, I guess, out of a jar. I don't know, but they were supposedly not showing any preference to anybody. It was all done by numbers, and so my number, I was in the second draft. I don't know what date the first one was, but for a year, and I was looking forward to getting out after I had my first 10 months in, or whatever it was, because you accumulate some time off for the time you've served. So I thought I was going to get out, because you know, life in the Army in those days was a little different than it is now. We started off living in tents because they didn't have barracks, and then we finally got things. And actually, we were using World War I uniforms, and we were wearing leggings that were laced up, and old type shoes, and old helmets, old World War I gas masks, and they didn't have, of course, enough rifles to go around, but everything was World War I, even the tanks, everything that we used for training was old, and of course that all changed after Pearl Harbor. And
do you remember where you were and what you were thinking when you heard Pearl Harbor had been bombed?
Yes, I was standing between the mess hall and the barracks out in the street, and we had sort of a central communication system with speakers, and they announced that Pearl Harbor had bombed. Of course, nobody knew anything about Pearl Harbor, never heard of it before, and so we didn't really know exactly what was going on, but everybody that heard it showed a lot of excitement, and so that changed everything. And in my course of service, I had become a typist in a company clerk, and So in there, working in personnel, then I had to go through all of the records of the men that were in our company, and I put a note in there that their length of service was going to be changed from a draft of 1 year to serve as long as the government wanted you for the convenience of the government. So that changed everything, and the men that were in when I went in as a draftee, the men prior to that were called as being in the United States Army, and the draftees were called Army of the United States. And we could always tell by looking in the personnel records if an individual was a regular Army person or if he had been drafted. So,
what was your feeling about the fact that that 1 year that you were looking forward to was now extended indefinitely?
Well, I didn't know really what that meant to me, because didn't know what was going to happen. But the more I learned about what was going to happen, I didn't want to get out. I felt like I was where I belonged, and I was really fortunate to have gotten a little experience prior to Pearl Harbor. And so now, when they started enlarging all of the services, anybody that had any experience was easily promoted to a higher rank, and where we started out at $21 a month, which was pretty well eaten up with the laundry and clothing being kept clean, cleaners, and your life insurance, which you felt like you needed to have. And there really wasn't much left over for spending money. So getting a promotion was really important, because all of a sudden I was getting higher pay, and working in personnel. I was working with commissioned officers, and they seemed to take an interest in me, and eventually asked me to go to an officer's school and get a commission. And I originally, at that time I was a sergeant, and I felt like a sergeant was being pretty good, in that I'd only been in a little over a year, and now they asked me to go to school and I'd be starting over in another level. So I really wasn't too excited about it, and actually turned it down that evening, and when they asked me. And then the next morning, when I saw a line of soldiers waiting to apply for what I had turned down, I changed my mind and went in and told them that I had changed my mind. And so, as it turned out, the unit that I was in went to Africa and was wiped out in combat. And the fact that I was going to school, they held me back to be in the next class that started to get a commission. So I was fortunate to have made that decision.
So because the fact that you were held back for officers training, you didn't go with that unit to Africa? Is that?
No, I didn't go. They put me in a temporary unit to hold me there to wait for the next class. I had to go before a board for a lengthy interview to find out if the board felt that I was commissioned officer material. And I was so nervous that I couldn't even remember when I was born. But anyway, I guess I fooled them because they let me in. And so it was a whole new world, and starting as an officer And so from there, I no longer was in the infantry. I was in the armored service, and after graduation, I was sent to the 5th Armored Division in California. And when I got there, I found out that they were sending the men that was sent there on to a tank destroyer unit that was just being filled out with men. So they already had the cadre that was sent from Fort Knox to Camp Cook, California. And so that's when I got my start with the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and I stayed with them until I was discharged. So when I got with the Tank Destroyer unit, we started out there getting new men, and when we got filled up with men, then they sent us on desert maneuvers, and I think that they were planning on us going to Africa to be on the desert, but the time we got through the maneuvers, they had started a tank destroyer school in what was then called Camp Hood, Texas. So we went to school down there with the whole battalion. We had loaded our vehicles up on a train, flatbed cars, and set up a kitchen on the train for the personnel to eat. And we moved to Camp Hood, Texas, and so we went through tank destroyer training down there, and we had half-tracks, armored half-tracks for transportation with 75 millimeter guns, and that was what we started with in tank destroyers. And from there we moved to Camp Adair, Oregon, and while I was in Camp Adair, Oregon, we were sent to Yakima, Washington for tank destroyer firing, and we went there and built a firing range with moving targets and so forth for the gunners on the tank destroyers to fire and become experts in that line of work. And eventually we got new vehicles which were full track rather than half tracks. They were full tracks and they looked like tanks. The only difference was that tanks have a lid on top, and ours were open, and they were thin-skinned, so that they looked like they would knock off anything that hit it, but it wasn't true. And but being thin-skinned, we could fire and run off and hide somewhere if there was something to hide behind. But the armor plate was very thin, and so it was sort of like the motto is seek, strike, and destroy. But we had to have a place to run to or get hit. And if we got hit, that was the end of it, because something that went through would set off the ammunition that we was carrying and wipe everybody out that was in the tank. So anyway, we went from Camp Adair. They went on maneuvers there. Actually, myself was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where that is the artillery center and they had a school there for officers to attend to learn how to fire weapons that we had as artillery, so that we didn't fire just at other tanks. We could also use them for firing at targets that we couldn't see. If we were given coordinates, we could use the coordinates to plot the enemy targets, and through plotting our tanks on the same map, our location, then we could use instruments like protractors and scales, and the instruments that we were issued, we could hit targets that we couldn't see. And so even though we might be fighting during the day against tanks, at night we would do a lot of what they called harassing fire, and keeps the enemy awake. Of course, we were awake too doing this firing, but we kind of passed it around. We had 36 of these tanks in our battalion, and in the training that I received at Fort Sill, which was a 4-month course, we had to go through learning the use of slide rules and know trigonometry, and learn how to use the guns and the information that was fed to us to hit targets.
Now, would you, once you were done with this, would you go back and train your unit, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Then I had to go back and train the people in our battalion. Actually, they sent 3 of us officers. At that time, I was an executive officer, which is the position right below the company commander. And they sent the executive officer. We had 3 line companies, A, B, and C, and I was in C company, and so I was responsible for training everybody in C company, and the other officers taught their men. And of course, at times I would be doing the direction for firing just our company tanks, or sometimes all the tanks, depending on the location of us and the location of the targets. So anyway, that was really a safer feeling when you were firing indirectly than firing head on into somebody, because once you fire somebody, they're going to fire back.
Right.
So anyway,
well, can I interrupt you real quick with,
sure.
with a quick question? I want to throw off your train of thought, but in your training, you were crisscrossing the country, a number of bases. Did you ever have a chance to, like on the way to Oklahoma, have a chance to stop in Nebraska and see your folks? Were you able to get home during that time period? And,
yes.
And what was it like as well? You said you were this country boy from Nebraska, getting out and seeing very different parts of the country and meeting different people from around the country. What was that experience like?
Well, I tell you, it gave me a lot of ideas of places to live once I became a civilian again. And California, of course, I had a lot of people that were in California that had moved there to get in defense work. So I was able to visit my sister and her husband in Los Angeles area, and meet some of the other fellas that were in defense work while I was there. So anyway, yeah, to get around the United States like we did was really a new experience. I don't think I had ever rode a train before. But we were moving our vehicles by train. You can't move a track vehicle very far on the roads without wearing the vehicle out, as well as the roads. So anyway, we got a lot of experience about how to load a train with vehicles and set up a kitchen, and we always had a few cars for sleeping facilities. So, and I found out that being an officer, you get a lot of comforts when it comes to sleeping accommodations that the enlisted men didn't have. So I was happy with being an officer. And so anyway, we went to Yakima 2 different times to do firing of our vehicles. And so between my training I had at the officer school at Fort Knox, the Tank Destroyer School in Fort Hood, and the artillery school in Fort Sill. Actually, I was away going to school quite a bit, but each time I came back to the C Company in the 705th Tank Destroyers, so I was back with the men that I was acquainted with, and we had a lot of time together in teaching and learning experience for everybody. So eventually we moved, the last move we had was to Fort Lewis, Washington, and I was away to school when they got their word that they was going to be moving to Fort Lewis, and I was coming back from the artillery school, and I had stopped in Los Angeles again, and getting from there up the coast to where the 705 was, I decided it'd be better to buy a car. And I bought a car, and I think it was
First car you'd ever owned?
No, I had a car when I went in. It was sitting at home on blocks. It was a 37 Plymouth. And my folks had written to me and said that somebody wanted to buy it, wanted to know if I would sell it, because it was sitting on blocks. And so I told them to go ahead and sell it. So anyway, it was a Plymouth Coupe, and the tires on it, of course, were old. And one in my letters from home, one day I got a letter saying that the people that bought my car, the spare tire was behind the driver's seat, and it had blown up in the car while they was driving. And I guess it just about wiped them out, because they were really not expecting something like that to happen. But anyway, yeah, I went ahead and bought a car, and it was, I think, a 40 Chevrolet or 41, and I found out that I needed tires for it to drive it to the base, so I had to go to the draft board and plead for a ration book to buy tires, and showed them my orders, and they give me the ration book, and I went and bought a set of tires for it. And upon arrival at Camp Adair, Oregon, they saw me drive up in that car, and they said, "You know we're moving, and you can't take your car with you." So I had to immediately take it into town and go to a dealer and take whatever he offered. But it looked good with new tires, so I got my money back. But anyway, we moved to Fort Lewis, Washington, and not there too long, and we got our orders to go to, I think it was Camp Shanks, New York, where we was going to load up on the Queen Elizabeth and go to England. And so we again loaded up on a train, and this time we didn't take any equipment with us. And we went to New York by train, the whole battalion, and we were there just a few days, and the Queen Elizabeth was anchored there in the New York harbor, so we could see our ship, and eventually they loaded us onto the Queen Elizabeth. Excuse me, Queen Elizabeth, and we made the trip with the battalion doing KP duty for the whole ship, and there was around 15,000 troops on that ship, and they had bunks in the swimming pool, and any place they could put bunks, they had them, and they even had people sleeping on the decks. And
as an officer, were facilities a little bit better for you, or?
Well, yeah, we had a stateroom with bunks fastened to the wall, about 4 high, and so we made the trip unescorted because they said that Queen Elizabeth would zigzag, and with the speed that it had, they would turn often enough that a submarine could not get a sighting on it to fire an effective round. So anyway, we made the uneventful trip to I think it's called the Firth of Clyde in Scotland, and anchored there.
How was it, once again, as a Nebraska landlocked country boy, probably on a ship for his first time? What was the crossing like? I heard horror stories about everybody getting sick. Did you get your sea legs?
It was okay. We had really an okay trip. I think it took 5 days, maybe longer. I don't know, but I know it was a week or less. And then we was unloaded off of it by lighter to a train that was waiting for us in Scotland. And we got on that train and rode it down into England. And
what's roughly the time period now, as far as the year and yeah?
Okay. Yeah, here it is. We went to Camp Shanks in April of 1944.
Okay.
And we loaded up on the Queen Elizabeth on the 20th of April, and debarked off of the ship on the 27th.
Okay.
And then on the 28th we got to England. This is all 1944. Mm-hmm. And we spent most of our time at Trowbridge, England. And there were so many troops in England getting ready for the invasion that there wasn't even use of land available to set up tents and live. And they provided us with like a warehouse where they had woolen mills or libraries, and the officers were all farmed out to private homes. And the home I stayed in was a typical English home where they're all adjoining, and you couldn't get from the front yard to the back without going through the house. I had a bedroom on the second floor of this house. It was a private room, and another officer from our unit had another bedroom on the second floor, and the family that we stayed with, he was a veterinarian, and he had a wife and 2 children and a nanny. So on weekends, the nanny would serve us breakfast in our bedroom. And but the rest of the time we ate with our kitchens with the companies that we belonged to. So we didn't have any vehicles that we took from the United States. Most of us bought bicycles, so we'd have a way to get around. And I occasionally went with the man of the house, the veterinarian, the doctor, to a pub and found out what life was like for them going to a pub and shooting darts and drinking their warm beer. So, of course, eventually we got our orders to move to the beach where we would be loaded on LSTs. The invasion, we knew what was going on by the airplane activity the night of the invasion of France and Europe. And the sky was completely full of planes. All sorts of planes, but anywhere as you looked, it was solid with planes and all headed towards France. And so we knew what was going on, and so then this was, of course, the 6th of June, and we didn't, we got our new vehicles while we were there, new tanks that they had come out with, and so we had about a month to learn how to fire them, and they sent 2 men from the factory. They were representatives from the factory that built the tanks to find out if there was going to have any problems with them. And so they worked with our battalion maintenance officer, and so we went out and learned how to fire these tanks because they had a different gun than our old half-tracks and M10s had. Now we have the M18s, which was called the Hellcat, and they had a 76 millimeter rifle, which was capable of shooting a lot farther and a flatter trajectory. So anyway, had 5 men in each tank, and so we moved down to the English Channel in July, and this was the next month after the invasion.
Had you been getting word back about how the invasion was going and how conditions were over there, or how we were doing?
Oh yeah, of course we were getting a little taste of it from, actually we got a chance to go into London on leave, where of course they were getting bombed, and we saw the buzz bombs and so on that came in, and so even though we were in London, we still was not in combat, but we saw the effects of what London was going through with all the damage. And
can you describe that a little bit? What it looked like?
Okay, we rode the tube, I think it was called, over there, and in the subway where the tubes ran, it was full along all the rails of people that had their beds set up down there, so that they were trying to live through all of this bombing that was going on. And not have their sleep interrupted by sleeping down in those tubes. And it was amazing to see the number of people that just more or less lived down in those tubes. And we got to see a little of London despite the damage and that they suffered. So I don't know. It seemed like the more we saw what was going on, the more we wanted to be a part of it and get over there. So, however, we moved down to the English Channel, and it was sort of a downhill type area that we parked in, where we were looking right at the 2 LSTs that was going to take us over to France. And so they were sitting there with their doors all closed, and we were sitting on this road that was pointed right at the LSTs, and we could see them, and I know I was close enough to see them when they opened the doors on the front and put the ramps down. And we couldn't go on board because the lower level of the LSTs was more or less being used as hospitals, and they were completely, both LSTs were, the floors, the bottom deck was completely covered with wounded soldiers on litters. So we sat there and watched each one of those men on litters get carried off of the LST and walked past us as we were parked there waiting for our turn to get on. So after viewing all of these wounded, we could see that we might be on the ship coming back one of these days.
How did that play into your mind?
It bothered me,
Yeah.
and I think it bothered anybody to see that number of men that had been wounded. So anyway, we got loaded up, and it was in the evening time we got all loaded on there, and went across the channel, and it was kind of a rough ride on the channel. Those LSTs are flat bottom, and kind of like going out in the ocean in a bathtub. And I was trying to write my last note home, and I found out that I couldn't be doing that because I'm going to get sick. I started feeling a little nauseous, so I put everything away and waited for the landing on the other side. And I went up on deck to watch the landing and to see how they did it, because as they go in to land, they drop an anchor off the rear end of the LST. If they drop it too soon, then they don't get ashore. And if they drop it too late, then they can't pull themselves back off out into the water. So they have to be a good judge of the conditions when they go in, knowing the tide and what the tide's going to do. And so anyway, I watched them land, and from up on deck, and then I went on shore because we was on dry land with the bow, and I walked back around the back part of the LST as far as I go before getting in the water again. So I found out what it was all about, and of course coming in it was getting daylight, and we could see a lot of things on the coastline in the way of sunken vessels, all different kinds in the water, and the sky around us was had those balloons in the air to protect low-flying aircraft from coming in and strafing us while we were trying to unload. So, and of course we saw a lot of men in the water that was left from the invasion. They hadn't cleaned up yet.
Oh.
And so that was quite an experience to see all the debris in the water. And anyway, we did get ashore without any damage, and we moved to sort of an apple orchard. And since we'd all been up all night, we kind of camped out on in the apple orchard, and the sun was shining when we got in there. And I know I laid down and went to sleep, and I woke up. A little French boy was talking to me, and speaking French, so I don't know what he was saying, but we was still quite a ways from the front line. We you know, we could hear heavy fire, but not any small arms fire. So it was actually pretty close to the end of July when we got our first orders to get into combat. And I thought we would be going towards Germany, but instead we were sent towards Brest, and fought in the Brittany Peninsula until it was all cleaned out, except for the submarine pens in Brest, and we could not get those Germans to surrender. However, we did take thousands of prisoners that were in the infantry, and we went into several of the peninsulas on the Brest Peninsula, and we got an award from France for what we did in Brittany. And then after we got that finished, we went to Rennes for a little rest, getting our equipment repaired and new ones for those that we had lost, and new men from a replacement depot to replace the men we had lost, because we had had some men killed and men wounded. So anyway, we sat there for about a week getting everything back to full strength, and then we headed towards Paris and then on into Germany direction. We went to I can't think of the name of the place. It was anyway, around Belgium, and we got as far as the Siegfried Line, and we holed up there for about a week at the Siegfried Line. So,
now, did you guys go through Paris, or did you go around Paris?
We were the edge of it. We didn't stop in Paris at all. Mm-hmm. We just went around the edge of it and kept around going. And we got into anyway, the Maginot and the Siegfried Line, I get mixed up on them, but eventually we were sent up and through the Netherlands, and from there into Germany, and we ended up in sort of a mining area, Kohlscheid, Germany, and now it was getting close to Christmas, and actually they had a Christmas tree up, and they even had a horse come in the house where we were in the house that I had set up my headquarters in. At this point, I was now a company commander, and the company commander that we had when we went overseas had become a S2 intelligence officer in battalion headquarters. So then I took over the company, and I had orders to find a place to do indirect fire, and I was out wandering around in east of Germany, east of Kohlscheid, I might say, looking for a place to indirect fire, but that land is so flat there's no place to hide and fire. So I was really concerned about where I was going to put the tanks to do indirect fire. And when I came back in later in the afternoon, I found out that we had orders to go to Bastogne, Belgium. So that was sort of a frantic order we had received, that they were in desperate needs of us, and we were to go to Bastogne and become attached to the 101st Airborne. So
what was roughly the distance from Bastogne from where you're at?
I don't really know, but it took us that night, the next day, and into the next night to get there, and we were constantly under fire from Germans on the road down there. They were, the first night, they were dropping flares on us, and even though we were supposedly traveling without our lights, the flares pretty well lit everything up, so they could see what we were doing and where we were headed. But the battalion, I was sort of at the end of the column going towards Bastogne, being in C Company, and they had reconnaissance out in front, and headquarters battalion was clear to the rear, and I was in the lead of my company with all the tanks and trucks and jeeps and peeps and whatever behind me. And as we got closer to Bastogne on the second night of our travel, the head of the battalion got into combat, and I didn't know about it, but we were sitting there quite a long time, and finally I got out. I was riding in a command car, which is an armored car, and I got out to find out from the tank that I had been following from another company what the problem was, and I went up and I asked the driver what the problem was, and the tank commander, and they said they thought they were lost. Well, I didn't know how long I'd been following a tank that had been lost, and I didn't know where I was because we didn't have any maps since we were going to a strange area. We got to look at a sort of a map like you might get at a filling station to get a general idea of the direction to head to get to Bastogne when we were still in Kohlscheid, Germany, but we had nothing to go by as we got closer to Bastogne. So I was really concerned that I was in a country that didn't belong in. But nevertheless, we got to moving, and the road that we were on was the right road, and I got into Bastogne. It was nearing midnight, and I just went into 101st Airborne headquarters and reported in to them and told them I was there with a company of tank destroyers, and they said that they really needed help out between Bastogne and Foy. They had all of their parachute infantry out there with no help, and so they told me what road to take to get out there, and said there's a grove of trees a couple miles out from Bastogne on the left side of the road, and they had men there, and if I could just pull in there. So I left 4 of my tanks in town in Bastogne and the kitchen in my headquarters, and I went with my other 8 tanks in, left, then now it's midnight, and went out and found that grove of trees and pulled in there and reported to the 101st Airborne Infantry that was there, and they said that they had some men further up also that was in Foy, and they would like for me to send some of my tanks into Foy. So I stayed there with 4 tanks and sent the other 4 tanks about a mile on down the road to Foy, which is just 3 or 4 little buildings down there. And of course now we're still in the middle of the night, so didn't know too much about where we were or what things looked like, but we were in the trees with the 101st Airborne, and so we bedded down for the night, what was left of it. And the next morning, I think it was snowing, and I had crawled underneath my command car to sleep, and I had crawled out from underneath there to see what the situation was, and we were getting a lot of artillery fire, and it seemed like small arms fire too, and looked like tracers was filling the air, and it almost looked like a snowstorm with the tracers. And so I wanted to make sure that the road I'd come in on was covered by one of my tanks. So I got out of my command car and walked over to one of my tanks and noted that he could not fire his gun at the road, and if some tank came down there, he would be up on us before we wanted him to be. So I told him to move over just a little bit to where he could see down this road towards the enemy. And so I got through with that and moved back to my command car, crawled into the command car, and was told that by a fellow that come running up, the fellow I had just talked to with the tank had been killed. So I got on the radio and called our battalion headquarters in Bastogne and told them that we were under heavy fire, and so then about that time I got hit from a piece of shrapnel that would have been a tree burst, and I didn't know what it was, but it felt like something exploded in my chest. And so I asked one of the men in the back of the command car with me to take a look at my back to see what my wound looked like. So he raised up my clothes so he could see my back, and he says, pretty big hole, he says, I could put my fist in it. And I said, well, you better take me into the aid station. So they just started up the command car and drove it with me in the back into the aid station in Bastogne, and got in there, and they looked at me, and they lifted me out of the command car onto a stretcher, and then they loaded the stretcher from the aid station into an ambulance, and there was 3 others in the ambulance, 2 up above and one beside me, and there's 4 of us in it, and they headed us out of town and toward a hospital. And I don't know how they got out of Bastogne to this hospital, because The town was surrounded, but apparently they ignored the ambulance or something at that time, because actually the Germans had orders to kill everybody, and they were doing a good job of that. They were not taking prisoners. So anyway,
were you conscious this whole time? Were you in considerable amount of pain?
They must have given me something, because I remember getting to the first hospital, and the doctor knew me. He had been with our battalion at one time. His name was Doc Lampert, and he saw me laying on the floor on a stretcher, and he came over and asked me what I was doing there, and I tried to answer him, but I'd lost my voice, so I couldn't talk. So he said, well, we'll have you feeling better in a little bit, and they put me on an IV, and pretty soon I was, I think maybe I got an x-ray there, but I'm not sure. But I was given, I was stopped at a lot of hospitals between there and the English Channel. Actually, I think I was wounded on the 20th of December, and the 25th of December I was loaded onto the hospital ship. So it took about 5 days from when I was wounded to get on the hospital ship, and then they took me to across the channel with the hospital ship, and I think I was operated on the 27th in a GI hospital that had been set up near Trowbridge, England, and I was there. Well, they operated on me by making a new incision in my back, because the shrapnel had went in one place and traveled about halfway across my back, and it was in my chest wall. So they went in another area to take the shrapnel out, and I've now got it up here on the wall. And so anyway, it looks pretty good now, because I cleaned it up and silver plated it, but it was kind of messy, and it didn't seem to want to look any better at washing it, so I silver plated it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I was in the hospital with a heavy infection that they couldn't get rid of, and I was in there for about 2 months when they got a letter from that they brought into me, and said that they had never received a letter on any other patient before, but this had come through Eisenhower's headquarters, but my battalion wanted me back in combat if I was able to be discharged, when I was able to be discharged. So
At this point, up to this point, had you heard how your men were doing and how things were progressing
no,
with them?
I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't know anything at all about how they were doing, except in the newspaper that came out. I forget now the name of it.
Stars and Stripes?
Stars and Stripes. There was an article in there that mentioned them, and they had an article in there where they had been in combat with on a river that they were crossing. So other than that, I didn't know a thing until I eventually got back to them. And so anyway, they answered the letter and told them that I needed another 10 days before they could discharge me. So they took the drain out that they had in my back and put a bandage on me. And I don't know the times of all this, but I was still wearing a bandage when I left the hospital. I was given a week of recuperation outside of the hospital, and I could go anywhere in England, so I got a pass to go on the train up to Scotland. I went to Glasgow and kind of toured the town on their streetcars, and then went to a replacement depot where I was to pick up a couple of hundred men and take back to France with me. So that's what I did. I reported back into this replacement depot and got the 200 men and went back across the channel and dropped the men off at a replacement depot in France, and then I was hauled by various means of transportation back to my battalion, who was in combat in Germany. So,
what was the? Can you describe what the reunion was like when you arrived?
Well, I was devastated when I found out how many had been killed and wounded. I found out that not only was I lost to the command, to the battalion when I was wounded, but I had C Company, and A Company commander had lost one leg, and B Company commander had lost 2 legs, and the reconnaissance company commander had lost part of his arm. So lost all the company commanders except the maintenance in headquarters commander there. But we had about 200 men out of the 600 that had been either killed or wounded. So, and that was a devastation to me, because I knew these men, and I'd been with them, for several years, and made good friends with some of them. Some of them had gotten married, and I knew their wives while we was in the service, and so I was coming back to a new world, and the C Company that I'd been with, now my executive officer had taken over the company and been with them now quite a while, so they felt that they better leave him there and me take over another company that needed a company commander. And besides, I was now, I was a captain, and they didn't have a captain in A Company, so I took over A Company. So I had now a strange bunch of, strange to me. The A Company was a good company, and they had a good company commander prior to me being there as a new captain, but I felt out of place because I had a lot of respect for the company commander that they had before and lost a leg, and I felt that he was really a lot better equipped for the job that he had with A Company than I was, because he had a lot of college and ended up, I saw him after the war, and he had become a federal appeals judge for the northwestern part of the United States, and had a high position there. And actually the B Company man that B Company had lost both legs was now a congressman in Virginia. So anyway, that's the men that I had been living with in our officers' headquarters, as the officers had different living conditions in the United States. Not so much so after we got in combat, but we'd become well acquainted living in the officers' quarters. So anyway, life was a little different when I got with A Company, and but we finished the war. We're now with the 11th Armored Division, and the 11th Armored Division was divided into 2 commands, Command A and B, and I was with A, and but we were both involved with the liberation Mauthausen, which was one of the death camps in Austria.
Oh, geez.
So I had seen enough of bad conditions with dead people and wounded, and that I didn't really want to go into the inside of this death camp. But my tanks and all my vehicles were parked outside, and just sitting there waiting to move on down the road. But they were spending a lot of time out there going inside and trying to help these people that were dying. And so anyway, a lot of the men that had been prisoners came out the gate and climbed on our vehicles so they could get away from there. And so we saw what they looked like, and the war was still going, of course, but we could see it was winding down. We ended up in a little town in Austria, north of the Danube River, just north of Linz, Austria, and we eventually moved down to Linz, and they had a lot of displaced people corralled down there with a fence around them, and we kind of helped supervise the feeding and taking care of all the displaced people there. But eventually we were moved from there to Muncie, Austria, which is up in the Alps on a big lake. The lake was about 12 miles long and about 2 miles wide. But while we were in Linz, I asked one of the officers, maybe we ought to get one of those boats that's on the Danube. I'd never had a boat, and I thought, you know, we're been in combat and we're taking everything for our own use for a while. And in fact, before the war ended, I commandeered one of the big generators from the German army to give some light in the houses that we were using. And then, so this officer that I asked to get me a boat told me that I'd have to teach a class that he was supposed to teach if he was going to get me a boat. So I took over the class and he got me a boat, come back with it loaded in the back of a 6x6 truck, and so that was hauled to this big lake that we was moving to up in the Alps. And so when we got up in the Alps on Muncie, the company commanders were told to find a place for their officers to live in some house, but then we could use the trucks to haul the people we were displacing to another. They'd move to another friend's house or something. So me with a boat, I started looking for a house out in the water. So I found a boathouse that was 2-story and pretty nice looking, and it belonged to a doctor that had a mansion up on a hill across the road, but there was no road up to it. You had to walk. And I was looking for a place that I could drive to, so I knocked on the door and I asked this woman that answered the door if I could see her house. I was looking for a place to live, and she says, "Well, that's fine, come on in, you can live with me." And I said, "Well, I can't do that, but I'd like to look at the house and see if it would accommodate." I had 4 officers under me that would need beds, and so anyway, the men that I had were moved to a hotel in town, and so one officer had to stay in town with the men each night as the duty officer, so I only had to sleep 4 in the house, and it was equipped for 4 people to sleep. So, and that was upstairs, and it had a deck on the upstairs and as well as the downstairs facing the lake, so we could dive off of the decks into the water, and it was pretty cold up there for that. But that had 2 stalls inside the house for boats. So we'd drive the boat right in the house, and then had winches for lifting them out of the water. So anyway, I moved the young blonde and her son, a little boy, to a new place in Muncie, and I lived in that house. And while we were in Muncie, we set up some clubs. The war's over, and so we needed a place to spend some time at night. So we took over 3 buildings, one for an officers club, one for non-commissioned officers, and one for the enlisted men, so that they'd all fit in that way. And then we needed some booze for the clubs, so we sent 6 trucks back to where we had seen all these warehouses full of booze while we was fighting, back towards France. And so we sent those trucks out, and they come back just loaded with 5-star Hennessy cognac. So we put that in those clubs, and then we needed some mix. So we got a chemical engineer to make some mix for us, and so we run those clubs until we got orders to break up the battalion. And so the battalion eventually broke up, and I turned all of A Company's equipment, the tanks, all the personal stuff that we were issued, everything was turned back into ordnance or different depots in Austria or Germany. And
where you were and what you were thinking when you'd heard that Germany had surrendered and you'd made it through the war, and your feelings at that point?
Oh, I tell you, it seemed like, well, we felt that the end of the war was coming as we were more or less racing down the Autobahn in Germany. We could go so far, so fast. These tanks that we had would do 55 miles an hour, and we were just racing down there, and occasionally a sniper would kill somebody in our convoy, and that would wake us up to the point that we were still in combat. And so when they finally announced the surrender, I received the notice in a written message, which I still have, telling us what to do and what not to do, as the Germans might try to surrender to us. As at this point we had what was left of the German army in our area between us and the Russians, and it was a pretty compact area, and so the Russians had a reputation of not being very kind to the Germans, and that the United States was being a lot better to the Germans because of what had happened in the during combat. So of course we were not aware of how much the damage the Germans had done with just outright killing prisoners that they had taken, but we learned all that later. But anyway, the night of the surrender, a large group of Germans were trying to surrender to us, and we were not allowed to take them, and they were to surrender to the Russians. So I had to send 4 tanks out in the night to join with a combat force to help them turn the Germans around and make them surrender to the Russians. So in the middle of the day, when we got the notice that the war was over and there would be no more combat, it was kind of a day of celebration the rest of the day. And so I knew that there had been plenty of alcohol available and around, and I really didn't object to the men having a drink. But I didn't know if they was going to be in condition to go out at night and get into combat, trying to turn Germans around. But that was what we had to do. So I was really concerned, and I, for the first time, was able to send tanks down the road with their lights on. And of course their lights had been taken off and stored inside, and so now to get them operable was another problem because they hadn't been tried for a long time. So anyway, I stood out there on the road and watched those tanks go by, and one of them didn't have any lights, and I thought, well, I don't know if he couldn't get into work or what his problem is, but he's going and I'm not going to chase him. So anyway, it turned out okay.
Was it hard turning those Germans around? And
apparently not, because they all came back shortly, and they saw that we would use force needed to make them surrender.
Did you guys ever come in contact with the Russians? Were you ever
no.
okay.
Well, not me personally. Some of the men in the battalion did come in contact with them, and I think they had a party, but one of the men that I still am in contact with borrowed he was an enlisted man, and he spoke Russian. So he was, our battalion commander had been killed while I was in the hospital from my wound, and he was replaced by a West Point graduate that was now in command, and he had been, our battalion headquarters had been invited to some sort of a Russian party, and so they took Joe Zepzauer, the enlisted man, and dressed him up in one of the other large-sized men. They're both big, so he needed a big uniform, but they put the commissioned officer's uniform on Joe Zepzauer, who I think was a sergeant, but he went with the battalion commander and his men to this party to visit the Russians. So anyway, that's still a story that we hear about when we get a reunion going. So anyway, when I got out of the service and came back to the States, I didn't think I would ever see anybody that I was with in the Army. And as the years went on, I didn't see any. I did get a letter from a fellow that was my first sergeant in C Company, and I kept that letter, and how it got forwarded to me, because I went in from Nebraska and all my records were showing an address in Nebraska, and in fact the fellow that was a congressman in Virginia came to visit me, the one that lost both legs. He came to Nebraska to visit me, but my parents had to tell him that I'm now living in California, and so his visit to me was for naught. But anyway, I had saved that letter from this fellow that had wrote to me in Virginia, and this letter. He lived in in Virginia, yeah, and the congressman was from West Virginia. Anyway, I was working for the city of Los Angeles on the waterfront, in the harbor, and I was sent to Washington, D.C. Once in a while for some meetings, and one time I took this letter with me and decided to try to call this fellow that wrote me a letter years ago, and after a few tries he finally answered the telephone, and he wanted to know where I was calling from, and I told him I was in Washington, D.C. And he says, well, are you unpacked? He says, I'm going to come in and pick you up. And I says, no, I have to be in a meeting in the morning. And he says, don't make any difference, I'll take you to the meeting. So anyway, it led to me finding out that they had been having reunions and they hadn't been able to get a hold of me. So since I found out about that, which was probably, I don't know, I could look and see, but many, many years after I got out of the service, and they were having the next reunion in Texas, which I went to, and I got to see all these fellows that had been coming to the reunions, and they had about 100 veterans coming to the reunions at that point in time, along with their wives. And so anyway, the size of that group going to reunions has dwindled down to where we had 7 veterans at the last reunion. Some of them are still able to travel, but their spouses need full-time care and they have to stay home, and a lot of them are in nursing homes. And so anyway, some way or another I became the president, secretary, and treasurer, and so I have a lot of the records that have been forwarded to me. I have the history for the outfit, because one of the men that was one of my tank commanders was killed, and his family was so interested in meeting the veterans that was with him when he was killed, came to our reunion, and they have been to every reunion since. And after the first reunion, they brought a tape recorder and camera and photographed everybody and interviewed every veteran, and then got the telephone and addresses of those that couldn't attend and interviewed them over the telephone. And they put together 3 volumes of history, which it cost $100 to print each set, and so they were made available to anybody, and a lot of the descendants have bought those books, and it's too bad that more of them didn't participate in the reunions, because they took those photographs out of their scrapbooks and put the pictures in the history books. So they mean more to people that have their pictures in there than the ones that don't. But it has all the men that were wounded and how they got their wounds in some cases, and those that were killed. And so anyway, we have participated in the building of museums with donations. Some of the fellows donate heavily towards our treasury, and we had dues, very reasonable, $10 a year for the cost of printing the newsletters, and I put them out every 3 months, or have been, so it takes a lot of postage and printing costs and envelopes and stationery and telephone calls. So anyway, I get a lot of credit for, they say, keeping the outfit together.
Yeah.
Because a lot of units never see each other again. And it's too bad,
Yeah.
because they, through emails and telephone calls that I get, they're just frantically searching for somebody that knew somebody that was in the service that they think you might know. So,
well, let me ask a few, just a few questions, and then we'll wind down this interview. Could you describe to us, particularly myself, that has no concept of what it's like to be in battle? What are conditions? What are conditions like? How did you handle the stress? How did you function? How did you manage to keep going with? I know that period of time was one of the worst winters in Europe had experienced. So you're under those kind of conditions. You're under war conditions. The stress. How did you and your men keep going? Do you think?
well, I tell you, it's the first time you feel like somebody's shooting at you. You hear the gunfire. You're scared to death. And if you're not, you're lying. If you don't admit it. And then you probably have to go to the bathroom about the first chance you get. And then when it gets dark, and you've got to find a place to lay down and go to sleep, and you're wondering if you're protected, your guards are doing their job and placed out properly, and they're not going to sleep, and so you worry about a lot of things. If you're doing the right thing when you're awake, and if you're doing the right thing before you go to sleep, because you don't know what's out there in the dark. And
did that uncertainty play on you? Did it eat away at you, or
well,
did you
I
come
think
to accept
so.
it?
I think it does, but you don't realize it. But you, you know, we were all issued a sidearm as well as a carbine or a rifle, and I kept mine right at my pillow all the time at night, and I was ready to shoot anytime I needed. And then it's stressful, because then in the daytime when you like me, I was firing 12 tanks maybe at the same time when we was doing indirect fire, or sometimes we were firing at a distance, and I was out in front and I could see the German troops, and I could fire all 12 tanks at this group of but you had no personal feelings as long as you're not that close to them, you know, just let them have it. So, but conditions are tough. I mean, you eat when you can. We had individual rations, which, you know, you have to be hungry to eat them. And we had little stoves that ran on gasoline, and we were issued called 10-in-1 rations, which had rations that you could heat up on the little stove that came in a stainless container, and you put the food in the stainless container, but it always seemed to smell of gasoline. But sometimes we would heat the canned food up to punch a hole in it before you put it on the engine, so that it would give it a little heat. But you know, you were issued these little rations that had 3 or 4 cigarettes in there and some toilet tissue, and you know, depending on whether it was a breakfast or lunch or dinner menu, but they were pretty much all the same. they have it better nowadays, but anyway, we survived. Brushing your teeth, washing your face, those were kind of far between. Once in a while, we would get a notice that some sort of a shower facility had pulled up in an area behind us, and we could send the men back and run them through the shower. And it was just a kind of a spray off. You couldn't stop, and you know, it was just a real quickie, and you were all through and back on the road again. It was stressful, and I didn't realize until I got home after the war was all over.
And that leads me to my next question. How was it transitioning, one, not only just from the military to civilian life, but the horrors of war and what you'd been through to civilian life? How was that transition? And
well, it seemed okay as long as we were together. But when we broke up and came home, and you got back into what was civilian life, I felt different. I didn't know what it was, and I couldn't eat, and I lost a lot of weight, and I just wasn't hungry, and I didn't feel good, and I went to a doctor, and he said, well, you know, eventually you'll probably get to feeling better, but he said, I really can't find anything wrong with you. So, but it was different. I tell you, it took a long time to forget what all you had done and did, and it's a change, you know. And they didn't have a name for it.
Yeah.
Those days.
Right. Did time ever help that at all?
Yeah. Now it's it all seems like a bad dream, you know. But we got a lot of recognition for what we did, and I feel good about that. There's some people that feel like we didn't get enough recognition, and I think some got too much and went to their heads. I don't like to talk about that, but I think it had happened.
Yeah.
We were with the 101st Airborne in Bastogne, and they got a lot of recognition because of the movie. Did you see it?
The Band of Brothers.
Did you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And they didn't show us being there, but I have a letter from a 101st Airborne veteran that said he had been looking for somebody from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion ever since Bastogne. And he had never seen anybody from the 705th to thank him, because he said we were all going to be dead. The tanks were there, and it was getting daylight, and we knew that they was going to. We didn't have anything but rifles, and there was no way that we could do anything with the tanks. And lo and behold, the tanks showed up, and they started getting destroyed. You were shooting over our heads, knocking those tanks out. And he said, I owe 62 years of my life to the 705. So anyway, he bought me a life membership in the Purple Heart Association, and he's been on the phone 2 or 3 times a week ever since he got a hold of my telephone number.
I'll be darned.
And so I put his letter in the last newsletter, not this one I just put together yesterday, but the one before. I put it in the newsletter so that the veterans all got it straightly from him. But Winters, the company commander,
Yeah.
with this outfit here, Garnier, the guy that lost a leg.
Yeah.
Okay, he sent me this.
I'll be darned.
And anyway, I read Winter's book that says Beyond the Band of Brothers, and he wrote the book. And I could see by reading the book that it really went to his head when he saw himself in the movie, played by Hanks, and of course the screen people that put it together, and it just, it's too bad. I think he was a good man, no doubt, because apparently all of his men adored him, and you have to have that kind of thought from the men, otherwise they're not going to work with you.
Which it sounds like you had as well, from the sounds of that letter that came to the hospital. It was
well, I liked the men, and we had a good rapport, and so anyway, this family that put these books together. You'll have to take a look at these before you leave.
okay.
And I got this the other day from the greatest foundation, the greatest generation in Denver. And then I got this. Gotta go to an Avalanche game next week.
Huh. I'll be darned.
So,
Well, we'll close out. I'd like to just ask one
fine.
last question. How do you think the war affected your life, or what in that period of time? How did you?
well, it did in the fact that I still didn't have a vocation when I got out. I had, of course, schooling coming to me, but I needed to. Now I'm like almost 30 years old, and I need to go to work. And so when I got out, I still couldn't raise my left arm. And they had me on 50% disability. So I went to watchmaker school. I was going to work on watches. And after I had a chance to get rehabilitated and work on watches, I decided that that was not for my life. So I graduated from that school, however, and then went to work in a jewelry store in Los Angeles, and got engaged, and I was really hating my work, and the assistant manager of this jewelry store, this large store, asked me when I was getting married, and I said, not as long as I work here. And he said, well, gee, if that's the way you feel about it, maybe you ought to quit. And I says, I think I will. And I just walked out right then. And then they came to the house that night and tried to get me to come back. But I says, no, I needed it to make a move. So I ended up, I checked some books out of the library on civil engineering, and started studying, and just the books. And I got a job with the city of Los Angeles as an engineering aide, and started working as that, and going to school at the same time.
Able to take care of the take advantage of the GI Bill.
Yeah. So anyway, I actually went to school off and on for 30 years. I had a desire to keep learning, and so I worked at Los Angeles Harbor for 30 years and retired from that, and then went to work for a contractor for 5 years as project manager of different jobs and estimator and so on. And it worked real well for me because in the indirect fire that I got started in, surveying, you might say, interested me. So I got into solving difficult problems, going to school at night, and so that really led me from the artillery work into what became my work. And I really enjoyed the water work, working at the harbor, working with shipping companies and in the engineering department, building wharves and piers and laying out the channels and dredging and putting in the streets, the sewers, the railroads. The harbor is immensely different now than it was when I went to work there, and it's since I retired in '78 from the harbor, it still made a lot of changes. But you know, we were building transit sheds. They're 1,008 feet long, 200 foot wide, clear span. That's a big building. Like, you see, 1,200 would be almost 5 acres inside of the building. And there's no posts, except for a firewall in the middle that they could close. But we were building that for the shipping companies, different companies. And when I quit, we were tearing those buildings down when I retired. And building cranes for container traffic. And so, of course, the container cranes all have to have electricity to them and rails. And so, and then, of course, they started building larger ships. And so I was involved with all that kind of stuff. They'd gone through all those changes, and they were very good to me at the harbor. I'd been there, of course, a long time, and they tried to make me a giant, and I didn't want to be. I wanted to stay right where I was. I was happy. I didn't need any more money. And then when I retired, I found out that there were several companies that wanted me to work for them, so I made an agreement with one company for 5 years, and they gave me a new car and profit sharing and all kinds of goodies. So I had my retirement, and I had that, and I just really ended up real well.
Good.
So
very good.
That's how the Army affected my life in the end, because of the artillery school, really. Because I didn't get any trigonometry in my high school in Nebraska. But I got acquainted with the slide rule, and then, of course, as work went on, I got into computers at work.
Well, we'll close down this interview. I once again want to thank you for your participation in this project, but more importantly, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All right.
After I was commissioned, this one down here is when I was an enlisted man, when I first went in 41.
Okay.
And then this one here is before going into combat somewhere along the line, before we went overseas. And then, of course, the Bronze Stars, the one on the left up there, and then the Purple Heart. And then the next one is from France, the Medal of the Jubilee of Liberty. And then the next medal is the European Africa Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with a Silver Service Star for taking part in the campaign. And then the World War II Victory Medal. And then the last one is the American Campaign Medal. Now we also had a Foliage Bergère from Belgium that's not up there. And I think we also got something like that from France that's not there. But they were unit awards. And so the Honorable Service Lapel World War II, the golden, the little one, is just below and between the third and fourth ribbons. The large 1760 silver coin was given me by that young female at that house we took over up on Muncie Lake.
Okay.
I asked her for a souvenir, and so she said she'd get me something, and she came back as we were driving out of town and stopped the convoy and handed me that.
Huh.
And it's a 1760. So the Blue Cross with the German swastika is a medal that was given to the new mothers that had given birth to a male baby. And I found it in a home where I'd spent the night during combat. The Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge patch is there. The square blue World War II lapel pin was given to veterans involved in World War II. And then there's the Disabled Veterans lapel pin is given to members of that organization. The orange pin with the tiger head is the Tank Destroyer insignia icon.
And you guys were known as, what was your nickname?
Tank Destroyers, we was, I don't know, we had Hellcats.
Oh, Hellcats, okay.
The Hellcats, what our tanks were. The shrapnel was given to me after it was removed from my chest by surgery through an incision in my back. The surgery was done in a U.S. temporary hospital near Torquay, England. The lapel pin with one round and the red burst in the center was the 705 TD Battalion coat of arms. And the cloth embroidered shoulder patch was worn by all Tank Destroyer personnel. The triangular pins and the shoulder patch from the 1st and 11th Armored Divisions are units that I served with. The 1st Armored was the first one I was in, and the 11th Armored is the one we ended up with at the end of the war, after Bastogne. The gold-framed blue ribbon at the bottom, below the TD patch, is a Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award that a unit can receive.
This is this right here?
Yes.
Okay.
And the little pins in the middle mean that you received it more than one time. So, and the dog tags on the left, right there to the right of that big picture, are the officers' dog tags. And I guess the ones with the cloth are the enlisted men's dog tags that are left when I first went into service.
Very good.
C. That was my company.
Okay.
And this is the veterans of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. It was done in 2001.
2001, okay.
And this is 2002.
And when's your next reunion then?
Well, they want to have one in Jacksonville, Florida next year. We had one in Valley Forge this year with...
This was done at, this is the Valley Forge reunion?
Yes, just outside of Philadelphia. But that's the driver and assistant driver.
What were conditions like inside these tanks?
Well, it's noisy and it's hard. You have, this is the new ones that we went into combat with. That's the M18. And you have to have head protection on, not from bullets, but from just the ride inside. If you hit something that gets metal is hard.